Would you turn with me, please, to Matthew and chapter 19, from whence our subject is taken, where Christ says in verse 6 at the end of the verse, "Wherefore, what therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." And if Christ's conversation with the Pharisees had finished at that point, how easy life would have been. But he was provoked to answer a further question. And part of his answer uses the phrase, "except it be for fornication." And the explanation and the understanding of that phrase has divided the brotherhood for decades. I have a leaflet produced officially with the blessing of the CMPA, which seeks to make an understanding of these verses, and it admits on the first or second page that there's basically two views extant in the brotherhood. This was in about 1975. Basically, that divorce was fine and okay, and the other view was that divorce wasn't fine and okay. And this leaflet seeks to bring together these views, and to what in effect it does is paper over some pretty huge cracks. And it might be argued it's been pretty successful, because there has been no division on the subject ever since. So we're going to need to get to grips with why he said it and the context in which he said it. And I think once we've got those things, we'll find the explanation is actually pretty simple. But we'll come on to that in due course. We're going to put aside the views of this and that brother and what we might find in this and that leaflet, of which there are plenty, and just come back to doing a straightforward, simple, scriptural analysis of what we find. Just one other thing before we start in earnest and go to Genesis chapter 2. One or two of the things that we have to touch on may appear to be, or may be indeed, a little sensitive, and maybe some might think they'd be perhaps left unsaid. But we need to get to grips with what Christ actually meant, and so we must tackle these things. So then, let's start in the obvious place, which is Genesis chapter 2. And truly, the last few verses of Genesis chapter 2 are words which we know extremely well. We possibly know some of them off by heart, and we've possibly known them since we were perhaps 5 or 6 years old. And maybe we're just that bit too familiar with them, and we need to just take a step back and decide what we're actually being taught. Verse 21, "The Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof." So let's be clear. He took a rib, the flesh was closed up. So all the angel had in his hand was a rib, no flesh. Adam kept his flesh, he just lost his one rib. And what are we to understand by flesh of my flesh? And at the end of verse 24, "They shall be one flesh." We'll just have a look at chapter 6 and verse 12, where we read that God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Now, it doesn't mean all skin had corrupted God's way. It was the people that had corrupted God's way. They were the flesh. So, where we read in verse 23, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh," in effect he was saying that she was part of his body. And then we read, we'll just stay with this point, that these two are one. They shall be one flesh. Just have a look at chapter 5 and verse 2. Chapter 5 and verse 2, "Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam." It was Adam who called Eve. In the Creator's eyes, they were Adam. So we're beginning to build up a picture then of this oneness. Yes, of course, there were two individuals. There was Adam and Eve. But what we're being taught is this this oneness, this one flesh, this one of mind and purpose, and that had been now created the one out of the other. In verse 24, in the authorised version, it's not obvious who's speaking. Indeed, we might be forgiven for thinking that it was Adam who was speaking, because we're clearly told in verse 23 what Adam said, and then we read on into verse 24, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother. But if we just we'll come back into Genesis, but if you just glance at Matthew 19 again, we'll see that that's not the case. And when Christ uses this verse, he uses it to great effect. Matthew 19, and in verses 4 and 5, he answered and said unto them, have you not read that he that which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So what we have as Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 isn't uttered by Adam at all, it's uttered by the Creator. And we'll come back to this point, but it's very important that the Creator who designed the whole system of male and female made this utterance, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother. And of course at that stage there were no fathers and mothers. So it wasn't a statement of fact at the time, it was a prophecy of what was going to happen, an instruction as to what should happen, that a man should leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. Now these days we have the understanding of the word cleave as to divide. If a butcher uses a meat cleaver, he divides the joint into two. Now it means that here, in the authorised version, it means completely the opposite. It means to stick together. The word has completely and utterly changed its meaning. So then, the Creator says, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto, stick like glue, we might literally say, to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And we might add Genesis 5, and Yahweh called their name Adam. So, we're familiar with the story and with the effects, but we might sort of take a step back and say, what was the point of creating the woman out of a rib of the man? Creation had been made out of the dust of the earth. The living creatures were made out of the dust of the earth. Why not just repeat the process? Surely it is to make the point, indeed the whole point of the creation of the woman out of the man, was to establish the fact, as the Creator says, they shall be one flesh. And as Adam understood, this is now flesh of my flesh. There's more that could be said about Genesis 2, but we're just drawing out the facts to which Christ referred in Matthew 19, and we'll get there eventually, God willing. But we now need to look at two passages in the law, and look at Deuteronomy 22 and Deuteronomy 24. Obviously part of the law of Moses. But as we think of these passages as the law of Moses, can we just give all of the law its due status? It was the Father's instructions to his people. It wasn't just, if I can use that expression, the law of Moses. Yes, Moses was the instrument by which Yahweh imparted the law. But it was Yahweh's law for his people, his instructions to his people. And in Deuteronomy 22, and we come to verse 13. If a man take a wife, and go in unto her, and hate her, and give occasion of speech against her, and bring up an evil name upon her, and say, so this is the cause of the problem, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I found not her a maid. And if it came to be the case that she was not a maid, in other words, not a virgin, then in verse 21, It's brought to a head when they shall bring out the damsel of the door of her father's house. The men of her city shall stone her with stones that she die, because she hath wrought folly in Israel, to play the whore in her father's house. So shall they put away evil from among you. So if a woman had previous relationships and then came to be married, it transpired that she wasn't a virgin, she was to be stoned. Bear that in mind and go to Deuteronomy now and verse 22. Verse 22, chapter 22 and verse 22. If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman, so shalt thou put away evil from Israel. So then, if there had been irregularity before the marriage, the punishment was death. If there was adultery during the marriage, the punishment was death. Hard, but straightforward. Now go to chapter 24. We will incidentally be referring from time to time to chapter 22 and chapter 24. We just need to bear in mind which is which. So chapter 22 is the death for adultery chapter. Now, chapter 24 then, and verse 1. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it came to pass that she find no favour in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of her house. And then there's various rules as to what might happen subsequently. And we have to understand what is meant by the phrase, he hath found some uncleanness. And we're going to suggest when we get to Matthew 19, then in fact Matthew 19 explains it. But for the moment, we will just leave it on one side. It is some uncleanness. But the word uncleanness doesn't help us particularly. It would much better be translated as nakedness. And we make that point because it means, and in its context it means, the nakedness between a husband and wife. And we choose those words carefully. The problem of chapter 24 existed between husband and wife. Whatever it was. There was no third party. There was no adultery. There's no hint of that. That's dealt with in chapter 22. The consequence is death. Here in chapter 24, it was some private matter between husband and wife. The husband was allowed to divorce his wife. He didn't have to. It was a matter of choice. If he found some uncleanness, and if she find no favour in his eyes, it was his discretion. And that's why Christ refers to this chapter and says, for the hardness of your hearts, Moses wrote this. So the man was being hard, the implication being unnecessarily so, when he divorced his wife. That, of course, put her in a predicament. She had committed no crime. So what was to be done for her? And that's described in verse 2. When she departed out, this is just an aside really, but when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. And you may notice that the word wife is in italics. It's not there in the original. She may simply be another man's. And if the latter husband, and the word husband should really simply be a man. If the latter man hate her, and so other rules and regulations. I'm simply making the point that in verse 2, the words husband and wife are simply not there in the Hebrew. There has been a relationship of husband and wife. The hardness of the man has caused him to give his wife a bill of divorcement. What is she to do? She legally can then become another man's. But the terminology of husband and wife remains with the first marriage. Just stop and consider what we've thought about these two chapters. Chapter 22 is adultery. There are third parties involved. We all know what adultery is. Chapter 24 is something totally between husband and wife. This is the only time when a bill of divorcement was allowed, and even then it was optional according to the hardness of the man's heart, as Christ said. So that's the background then, the scriptural background to Matthew 19. So then let's go to Matthew 19. Remembering, of course, that Christ upheld the law. He upheld the law and quite often encouraged his hearers to raise themselves above the standard of the law. He raised the bar. What he never did was undermine the law or lower the standard. As far as Christ was concerned, he still existed in the time of the law. It was his Father's instructions to his people, and he upheld it completely. And we need to remember that as we read Matthew 19. So in verse 3 then we read the Pharisees came unto him. Let's just take a step back and say, well, who were the Pharisees? Well, the Pharisees concern themselves with what we might describe as the ethics of the law. But not simply the law of Moses as we have it in the first 5 books, but the law as had been, I was going to say developed, that's the wrong word really, added to over a period of time. They had added all manner of rules and regulations and expected their fellow Jews to keep all these rules and regulations which they had added to the purity of the law. Now we know what Christ thought about this. If you just pop over to chapter 23 for a minute. This is one of those chapters where you just love to have heard what was actually said. For example, in verse 16 of chapter 23. Woe unto you, ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. There's nothing about that in the law of Moses. They'd added that, and they'd added this little refinement about either swear by the temple or swear by the gold of the temple. These little rules and regulations, of which I believe there were hundreds, and they expected the people to keep these. And Christ is ruthless in chapter 23 here in exposing them and repeatedly using this phrase, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, and so on. So Christ had absolutely no time whatsoever for all these additional rules and regulations. It was man-made. So when the Pharisees come to him, tempting him, saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Now in Christ's day, amongst the Pharisees, there on all sorts of topics, all these little topics that we've sort of attempted to briefly mention that have been added to the law, there were 2, if not more, ways of thinking, two schools of thought, the Hillel school of thought and the Shammai school of thought. And these were leading Pharisees who lived just before Christ's day and worked up a lot of these additional laws and rules and regulations. And sometimes they agreed with each other and sometimes they didn't. So you've got man-made regulations and man-made divisions of thought this way of thinking and another man-made division that thought that way of thinking. None of which needs actually to concern us, except that as far as divorce was concerned, these 2 schools of thought were in different camps. The Hillel school of thought and thinking was that divorce was acceptable for any cause almost. The Shammai school of thought was that divorce was only acceptable for adultery. Now, can we see straight away how the Pharisees of Christ's day have moved right away, that are miles away from the law of Moses? Chapter 22, adultery was death. The question here is, can a man put away his wife, divorce his wife for every cause? So they've completely undermined the law of Moses. They've abandoned what we have now as Deuteronomy 22 and Deuteronomy 24, or 22 in particular. So it's hardly surprising then that Christ doesn't answer their question directly by saying, yes, I agree with you on this clause or that clause. He refers not to Deuteronomy, which they themselves have abandoned, but he goes back to Genesis. Have you not read? Let me just re-emphasize what Christ says. He could have said, for example, have you not read, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother? Would have made perfectly sense, it would have been absolutely true, and would have, up to a point, served the purpose. It would answer the question. But notice how Christ answers this question. Notice how he, for want of a phrase, lays it on thick. He which made them at the beginning. See, he doesn't even refer to God or the Father. He emphasises the point that it is the Creator. And then he doesn't simply leave it there. He says, made them male and female. So the originator of the system of male and female, of husband and wife, of marriage, the God who designed that and put it all into place and into practice, and then went on to say, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to, stick to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Notice how Christ has built up his arguments about the way he refers to just who said what, and the importance that the Creator himself puts on the fact that, yes, you have a man and a woman, but they become one. Then Christ himself goes on to say, wherefore they are no more twain, but are one flesh. And then comments, or perhaps even we should use the word instructs. What therefore God hath joined together, and he's gone right back to Genesis. No need to go through all that again. He's gone right back to Genesis. What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. And that's a commandment of Christ, which we ignore at our peril. But the Pharisees, of course, weren't going to be put to silence quite so quickly. Or at least they didn't think they were. They say unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and put her away? Moses did absolutely no such thing. There is no such commandment in the law. We've already read Deuteronomy 24. Moses allowed, or to be more precise, Yahweh allowed, for the hardness of a man's heart, that the wife could be divorced for that private matter between husband and wife. Nothing whatsoever to do with adultery. That was death by stoning. So they ask him this false question, why then did Moses command? And notice the way he answers the question to emphasise what we've said. He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you, allowed you. There wasn't a command. He allowed you to put away your wives. And notice straight away in what we have as the same sentence, but from the beginning it was not so. So this is the second time now he's gone back to Genesis. It's almost as though he didn't really want to get involved in Deuteronomy 24, and he certainly didn't want to get involved in their completely erroneous discussions and arguments about what was divorce allowed for, was it allowable for adultery? Because the answer was quite simply just a big no. So he emphasises the point that there was no such command. But then he goes on to say in verse 9, and I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. Now the word here translated in the English fornication is porneia, from which of course we get our word pornography. And as we might expect, it includes the wide range of man's perverseness in his relationships between man and woman. It does also include adultery. But just look at the way in which Christ goes on to say, except it be for fornication or porneia, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. So Christ was perfectly well aware, as we might imagine. He knew exactly what adultery was. And if, when he used the word which we have as fornication, if he meant adultery, he would have said adultery, just like he did twice in the same sentence, in the same verse. So to argue that when Christ said fornication, he really meant adultery, just makes an absolute mockery of verse 9. It makes no sense whatsoever. So what did Christ mean then? Why did he use this very wide-ranging and quite honestly deeply unpleasant word, which we'd rather not think about? Well, I would suggest, it'd be interesting to know what you think about afterwards, perhaps in private, but I would suggest that when Christ used that word, he was actually explaining Deuteronomy 24. That was the matter of uncleanness or nakedness, privately between husband and wife. It was nothing to do with adultery. And if there was a putting away for some other reason, then adultery was indeed committed. Now the reaction of the disciples is interesting. His disciples say unto him, this is verse 10, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is good not to marry. Remember, they lived in this culture whereby a good number of people thought that it was absolutely fine, you could divorce your wife for any reason and start again. And so given that sort of cultural background, their reaction is quite understandable. And Christ's answer is really quite illuminating. We might think that he would say unto them, now come on, don't exaggerate, it's not that bad. You really can be married for life. But he doesn't say that, does he? He said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. And then he goes on to talk about eunuchs, which we're going to leave on one side. In effect, he agrees with them. He said, well, yeah, some people are better off not marrying if they can't stay the course. Because staying the course, the permanency of marriage, is exactly what Christ has been teaching, except for this one little exception, which is this reference back to Deuteronomy 24, and is exclusively a matter between husband and wife and no third party. So adultery has got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with it. And that really brings us to 1 Corinthians 7. But before we go there, would you just come back with me, please, to Matthew chapter 5. Because Matthew 19 is the second time this subject has been discussed. Now, we might suppose that adultery involves a third party to a marriage, which, of course, is absolutely the case. But just look at what Christ says in Matthew 5, in verse 31. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. Straight out of Deuteronomy 24. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. So the putting away causes the adultery. the putting away, the adultery is the consequence of the putting away, not the cause of the putting away. And I must admit, I'd read that verse for years before I appreciated that was what Christ actually said. So again, in chapter 5 here, he's not talking about divorce at all. He's talking about Deuteronomy 24. So then, let's go to 1 Corinthians 7. Christ has said, remember, it might be better to stay single. The implication being that the service of the Father might be better accomplished. And that's entirely consistent, or rather, Paul's teaching is entirely consistent with that. He starts off in chapter 7, verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Which is more or less what Christ said, that some could be eunuchs for the sake of the master. But he then goes on to say, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. And so he goes on to explain certain rules and regulations for those who would prefer to be married. So, in verse 10, for example, we're not going to look at this chapter in any great detail. Verse 10, unto the married I command, yet not I but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So the instructions of Paul in verses 10 and 11 are really very simple. No divorce. If you have to, separate. But there's no remarriage. Let her remain unmarried, or, and this obviously is the preferred option, be reconciled to her husband. Notice divorce just does not come in to 1 Corinthians 7. And again in verse 15, if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God calleth us to peace. So the scenario which I think is being mentioned here in this verse is that there are two people there's a husband and wife. One comes to a knowledge of the truth. The other one is thinking, I can't be doing with this, and departs. But you notice there's no mention of divorce. But also, we're not going to go through the whole chapter, but neither is there any mention of an acceptive clause. So is Paul's teaching then different to Christ's? Yes, it is. For the obvious reason that the only reason that Christ mentioned the giving a bill of divorcement was because the law of Moses still operated and he was upholding Deuteronomy 24. By the time we come to Paul's writing, there was no obligation to uphold the law. That's gone. That's been fulfilled. So that one little escape clause, as it were, was gone. And so then, brothers and sisters, I think we've made the case that there is simply no room for the brother or sister in Christ to be divorced. And of course, the obvious consequence of that, there's no remarriage. I think we've explained what Christ said in the context of his own time, in the context of the law, and in the context of Genesis 2. I'll just leave you with these two thoughts. Think of John the Baptist, who told Herod, it is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. And he lost his life because of that. So who are we to make excuses for it? And just by way of conclusion, come with me please to Hebrews 13, verse 4. Marriage is honourable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. And if God is going to judge them, brothers and sisters, who are we to make excuse?